Ulysses S. Grant was born on April 27, 1822. Grant's father enrolled Ulysses Grant into a military school. Grant was mistakenly enrolled under the name of Ulysses Simpson Grant instead of Hiram Ulysses Grant, but he never bothered to correct this, so this became his name. Grant was a talented horseman at a very young age. In March 1864, Grant is made Lieutenant General Commander of the Union Armies. Sadly, on July 23, 1885, Grant passed away. Now to Robert E. Lee's life. General Robert E. Lee was born on January 18, 1807, in Stratford. On April 1861, Lee was made commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. On October 12, 1870, Lee died. McLean's house was the scene of the surrender ceremony. The Union Army of 120,000 was led by Robert E. Lee. The Confederate Army of 30,000 was led by Ulysses S. Grant. At the time of the beginning of the Appomattox Courthouse battle, the North had a total of 670,000 square miles of land with 27,000 miles of tracks. On the other hand, the South had a total of 780,000 square miles with 9,000 miles of tracks. The Confederate soldiers had begun the battle outnumbered nearly 1-3. The Appomattox Courthouse battle had begun.
Robert E. Lee, following his successful attacks on April 1, 1865, decided to abandon the city of Petersburg, attempting to escape with the remnants of his army and head west of the village of Appomattox in Richmond. He hoped to join up with General Joseph Johnston's army that was trying to stop Sherman's advance in North Carolina, near the Danville Railroad, where the Confederacy could gather extra supplies at Lynchburg. But Grant was following them aggressively, with the Union's grip on them. Lee's outnumbered Confederate troops started to head south of the railroad, but before they could move, the forces of the Union made a breakthrough at Petersburg on April 2nd, where Grant severed the supply lines and forced the troops to mount a hurried overnight evacuation. After an engagement with Federal cavalry, the Confederacy was surrounded at the seat of Appomattox County, Virginia, 25 miles east of Lynchburg. In this time, before the battle, Robert E. Lee had already lost more than half of his army.
Leading up to the Appomattox Courthouse, both sides of the Civil War planned to fight very strategically using the many different routes they had planned. The South's plan was to bring the North to the South side so that the North would be fighting on unfamiliar ground. This would be a big advantage to the South. The South's plan was also to gain control of the North of the Union's capital, Washington, D.C., and to go to North Carolina to combine with Joe Johnston's army. However, the Confederacy was relying on supplies on the Mississippi River that the North was trying to cut off and gain control of. Once the North gained control of the Mississippi River, it would stop the North from gaining supplies and cut the South in half, which would be a greater advantage to the North. At the Appomattox Courthouse, the Union, which was General Ulysses S. Grant's army, had surrounded the Confederacy, which was General Robert E. Lee's army, and this cut off their supplies in the Confederate army. This gave Lee no choice but to surrender in the end.
Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Grant because his army of men were weak and exhausted. They couldn't provide themselves with weapons or equipment. Lee knew he couldn't defeat the Union. He knew there was little choice, but he had to consider surrendering. Since April 7, 1865, Grant and Lee have been sending messages to each other about whether or not Lee should surrender, because the Confederacy were hopeless. Grant and Lee both met at the McLean house for a meeting to surrender. Grant has set terms for Lee to follow. These terms were that the soldiers had to lay down their arms, but later free to go home, to keep their horse and days worth of food to Robert E. Lee's troops.
Although the surrender of Robert E. Lee ended the war, many events occurred after. Many Southern leaders continued to fight. On May 12th and May 13th in 1865, word still hadn't spread to the soldiers. The Battle of Palmyra Ranch was fought. In conclusion, though the battle was won by the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee's surrender officially ended the war. The McLean House was made into a National Historic Park in the town of Appomattox, Virginia. The McLean House was dismantled in 1893 in an attempt to try to move it to the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was never relocated. Eventually, the house was reconstructed in the 1940s.